relation to navigating COVID-19. So this series of webinars is aimed at supporting the industry. We recognise there's been quite a lot of support announced over the last week and a half. This is really to help you navigate your way to that support that's relevant for your particular business. And then over the course of the next sort of 4 weeks, we will be looking in detail at specific topics. So today we're going to do an overview of what has been announced so far in terms of emergency response. And then moving forward, we will do our more specific webinars. So please do keep an eye out for them. I'll start just by introducing myself and my colleagues who are going to be talking to you on the panel today. So I'm Hannah Vickers. I'm the Chief Exec of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. Joining me today is Julian Francis, who is our Director of External Affairs, who will be giving us some feedback from what's been happening in terms of the government engagement. And also when we get to the frequently asked questions, when we get to the question session of this webinar, so we will be joined by Stuart from Bays. So I know he wasn't advertised, but he is going to join us. So in terms of the structure of the webinar today, we're going to have a presentation from myself. We're going to have a presentation from Julian, just to share with you where we're up to in terms of industry support. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So if you're anything like me, you're still getting used to this technology, but you'll see on the right-hand side of your tab that you should have a sort of chat questions function. So please do keep putting your questions in. Doesn't matter if it's while we're presenting, because what we will do is collect those up, and sort of towards the end of the webinar, we will come back to the questions that you've asked. Now, I can't promise we'll have all of the answers today, but we will answer what we can today, and anything else we will take away and certainly come back to you and put the answer up on our website. So please do send those through as we're presenting. Right, so I think without further ado, we'll get started. Thank you, Chetna. Okay, so I've introduced myself. Like I said, I shall be chairing each of these webinars as we go through the course of them over the next 4 to 6 weeks. So you'll be a regular, hopefully a regular feature if you like today's one. If you don't, then we can swap in another presenter. Okay, so I'm just going to cover a little bit over the next sort of 5 minutes around what we actually know about the coronavirus and its impact, so that we can start to make considered decisions around our businesses and how we take them forward. So I have 3 slides on this. This is the first. Now, this information has come from the modelling that Imperial College have done. So this is modelling of impacts of the virus. So what you'll see here is if we were to be continuing in an unmitigated situation. So this was if we did nothing, we would be looking at this virus peaking sort of slightly later, kind of middle of May, June. What we're actually looking at is in the, if we look at the next slide, we'll see with the government's requirements in place. So some of the things that they've put in place, you'll see we've got showing from this model, you can see the peak in critical care beds and actually how that is impacted. So what you'll see here are the measures the government is taking. So this was on the graph A, the model showing, you know, what would happen if we did nothing, and what might happen if we sort of put in place these measures. And what you'll see here is actually, what you take away from this graph is the government has had to put these measures in place to try to lower that peak. Interestingly here, that shows that the model that potentially we would need these measures to a certain extent in place until September. Now, that is obviously not current government policy, but I think it's important for us to be looking at the same evidence the government is looking at in terms of making decisions around our businesses. So we are expecting some level of social distancing measures to be in place for a prolonged period. So I think that's quite an important point when we're thinking about making business decisions here. We will need to adapt. So if we move to the next slide, we can see a little bit around what this might look like. So the other interesting point, just as context, is that actually this isn't going to be the only peak that we have. This is the new normal for us. It will get easier because this is the first time we've had to mobilise and put in place all of these procedures and sort of site operating procedures around social distancing. But that is likely to continue until we find a vaccine. You'll see on this graph a number of interesting things. So the blocks that you'll see are the periods when the social distancing policies are in place, and the orange line is the spike in weekly cases. And you'll see at the moment, obviously, we've got this sharp rise and we've got that prolonged period of having social distancing measures in place. But even having had that initial phase, what it shows is that this will keep returning until we can find a vaccine, which is 12 to 18 months away. So all of those blue blocks you can see on here are a simulation of what we might experience in terms of social distancing policies. Now, they might be less extreme. It may be that they are just put in place in certain geographic areas because the idea is they're brought in order to suppress the spread of the disease in certain areas. So it may be that they are more sort of geographic than what we're seeing as a kind of blanket shutdown at the moment. It may be that actually we start to understand a bit better about disease transmission, and therefore they are less restrictive. But by and large, we will have some form of social distancing measures in place on and off, likely for the next 12 to 18 months. So we need to bear all of that in mind when we're making business decisions about how we structure ourselves, perhaps how we operate in future. I think that was everything I wanted to sort of cover in terms of context. Again, I just thought it was useful for us to bear that in mind when we then go into how we're planning our emergency response, because the decisions we take now are certainly going to have an impact on us in 6 months, 12 months time, and we just need to think about exactly what we do. Okay, so if I could move to the next slide, please. So just moving into where we can get help. So there's an awful lot, a huge amount of activity from the government, and a lot of hard work actually by the civil servants to get a lot of business support out. So we will circulate these. You can find all of these links on our website as well, but these are the sort of key links for you in terms of accessing some of the business support that I will be talking you through over the next few slides. Okay. So on to the next slide. I'm going to take this in a number of chunks because there is an awful lot in place. So the types of things that we've got already announced are tax breaks and deferrals. So there is a deferral option with the time to pay with HMRC. Now this at the moment does require you to get in contact with HMRC and arrange specific measures for your business, shall we say, to give you time to pay. And there is a financial charge in doing so. You will be charged interest. But that option is there, so it's worth being aware of that. Secondly, the government has announced that there is the VAT deferral, so that you will be able to defer any VAT payments due through your business for a period of 3 months. You don't need to apply to that, you just don't pay your VAT, but it is only a deferral, you will still have to pay it, so bear that in mind. But from a cash flow perspective, that is quite helpful. And lastly, perhaps less helpful, but worth bearing in mind, just one less thing on your to-do list, is that with Companies House, they are giving businesses an additional 3 months to file accounts so that you don't need to be focusing on that as a priority during this time. And there will be no financial penalties for doing that up to 3 months late. Okay. So moving on to grants and direct support. So again, this I think is probably the area of most new policy making, shall we say, which I think has been really powerful, but it has been done at pace. So we have these schemes, there are still quite a number of gaps and questions that need to be filled in. So to give you an overview, the government has announced the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Now this is of use to you if you have employees that are on PAYE who can no longer work. So it could be that they are no longer able to work because they can't access site. It may be that they are no longer able to work because you don't have work for them because your pipeline has slowed or has stopped. Now, in either of those circumstances, you can put the employees onto a scheme called the furlough scheme. So you designate them as being furloughed, and effectively what that means is you don't make them redundant, but they stop working for you on a temporary basis of up to 3 months, and the government will pay £2,500 towards their salary. Now, there's quite a lot of detail behind that scheme. There is more to come, but if you are thinking about contingency planning, it is very worth looking at that, because actually for an awful lot of businesses that have PAYE employees, that is probably going to be one of the things that will be the most helpful to you. There's been quite a lot of detail and quite a lot in the press around the self-employed and your self-assessment tax returns and support available to you. Now, there's not been much done so far in terms of policy announcements and support, but we are expecting something later today. So for the self-employed, I expect there to be something in the press conference that happens this afternoon. And it will probably be something akin to the PAYE scheme around supporting self-employed workers who cannot come to work because of the current health restrictions that are in place. So just moving on to statutory sick pay. This was one of the earlier and I think simpler policy interventions the government made around allowing SME businesses to be able to reclaim statutory sick pay. So that is further details of that on our website, but that's quite a basic relief that has been put in place. And then the last two are business grant funding. So we've seen quite a lot of this for other sectors. There are some that are grants that are currently eligible. So the first one is the small business grant funding. Now, this it says for eligible businesses, this is to do with your rateable value. This is to do with the size of your business. I will say, by and large, this isn't applicable to our industry, but it is worth looking at, particularly if you're a very, very small business. You may well qualify for this. And equally, there are similar schemes running in Wales and Scotland. Again, full details of how to access those are on our website. What I would say at the moment is that the eligibility is aimed a lot more at supporting those in the hospitality and leisure industry compared to the typical profile of companies in our industry at the moment. Now, that might change. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide. There are a number of loans that are available. So the top two are new initiatives, new policy announcements from the government. So they, for SMEs, have brought in a coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. It just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? And that is essentially a scheme where SMEs can access loans to help with their cash flow. So the government will step in and guarantee it. Now, as I said, a number of these have been announced quickly because the businesses need to know the support is available without some of the detail. So this one you might have seen in the press today around certain interpretations by the banks, meaning that you would need to give a personal guarantee on some of these loans. Now, what has emerged today is that only some banks are interpreting it in that way, and I think probably in terms of peer pressure, they will stop that. But the ones that we know don't do that are NatWest and Royal Bank of Scotland. So if you are looking to use this, you can go to them confidently knowing that they won't ask for a personal guarantee on this loan. So I think it will take a few weeks for these to really start to be processed, but it's worth exploring. It's worth starting to look at if you think you might need that support in the short term for your business cash flow. And then secondly, the similar scheme, but aimed at the much larger firms. So this is aimed at firms which will have a turnover of over sort of £42 million a year. And this is a Bank of England backed scheme. Now, again, early feedback is that there are some quite stringent criteria being applied. You will need to have or work through getting yourself a credit rating to be able to access this scheme as a larger business. But again, it is worth exploring. It is worth starting to look at it. And as with all of these, you know, I and the other business associations that you are members of will happily take feedback on how you're getting on, because it's really important for us to be working very closely with BEIS and feeding back where you are, or if you are having challenges or delays utilising any of these. So that's how we know about some of the challenges already. And then the last one is your, just sort of typical commercial lending. Some banks are varying that. They're varying conditions, they're varying the types of products that they offer. So even with your own bank, it is worth a conversation, albeit you would probably expect the government backed schemes to give you better terms, but that's not, it's probably for you to determine for yourself when you get into exactly what you need. Okay, so moving to the next slide. In addition to sort of cash support policy interventions, there have been some interesting interventions made around ways of working. Some of these I think are relevant because they may well have more of an impact perhaps than cash over the medium term. So on public procurement, there have been 2 procurement policy notices issued. The first one relates to new procurements, so almost emergency procurement, and certain sort of waiving of procurement regulations or relaxing of procurement processes whilst we are under this sort of emergency response period. So that's the first one here. The second note relates to where you are in a supply chain, and I will say this loosely, in a supply chain on a public project. So this relates to government procurement frameworks, government procurement contracts, and that is actually very, very generous. So it offers all sorts of waivers and continuing to support the industry where you can't deliver on that contract. So for example, if your site closes or if you can't work with your client, it offers certain waivers in there. It also puts quite a lot of pressure on the arm's length bodies to expedite cash flow through their supply chain. So it talks about shortening and putting in place more frequent payments, so every 14 days. It talks about making sure that cash is flowing throughout the supply chain and your responsibilities in that space as a public sector body. And that does apply to local authorities as well. So again, that one I think is definitely, if you've got part of your pipeline that is for a public sector client, it is very worthwhile making yourself aware of the detail in that notice so that you can ask for specific interventions. They should be doing it proactively, but it will take some time to work through with the arm's length bodies. And then moving on to actually operating on site. So this is something which is very live. There's been an awful lot in the press about that this week. Now, there are a number of guidance documents the Construction Leadership Council is working on to support businesses in making the right decisions around risk assessing whether or not and how they can operate their sites. So the edict from the Prime Minister has been very clear. Construction can continue, but we need to make sure that we are adhering to Public Health England guidelines. And that's what these procedures are aimed at. So they have been drafted to describe what that actually means in terms of operating, attending, working on a site. So again, I would urge you all to make yourself aware of those, think about how you will incorporate those into your own organisation's risk assessments, whether you're going onto somebody else's site or whether you're actually in charge of the site yourself. I think they're absolutely critical. There are 2 further guidance documents around this that are in development. So one is on critical works and the types of critical works that need to be able to continue. So you can imagine things like repairs and maintenance in an emergency to a hospital, for example. You wouldn't want somebody doing a risk assessment and saying that they couldn't attend and undertake that work. So that list is being compiled to offer guidance to the industry, to offer some assurance when we have people attending those sorts of emergencies that actually they are doing the right thing and they're not going to be penalised and they're not going to be fined or stopped by the police. So that's in part what that is about. And then lastly, there is some guidance on safely closing down and safely restarting your sites. So again, we will have seen a number of sites closed this week while they took into account this new risk assessment that they need to undertake in light of the social distancing guidelines in place. So there is 2 further documents which we expect to be out by the end of this week on those. And lastly, for those of you, particularly my members, who are looking forward to future pipeline, one to gently encourage your local authorities with is that actually The Coronavirus Act, which was passed, has detail in it, which means that actually planning committees can meet virtually. So there is no need for planning committees to stop. So the legislation has been passed to allow them to meet virtually, and we should be able, therefore, to continue to move the pipeline of work forward, ready for the recovery phase from this. So again, perhaps one that may not have filtered down to your planning committees yet, but there is no legislative reason now why they can't meet virtually. So please do remind them of that if they're holding things up. Okay, that was everything I was going to cover in terms of just setting out to you where we are up to with support that's already available. As I said, all of that is on our website. It is listed and updated every day, so please keep checking, and we will be publicising particularly things that are relevant to specific members. But that's everything that we've captured to date. There is still a lot going on with this. I've said we're expecting things in terms of support for the self-employed. We're expecting further measures, or certainly an approach by the Construction Leadership Council on further measures to support the industry. So there will be more support forthcoming, but please do keep an eye on our website and on Build UK's website for those of you who are in the construction or contracting area, because you will find the links that are relevant to the support you are open to you. So I shall pause there. That's quite a lot of information, I appreciate. What we'll do now is just hand over to Julian Francis, who is going to cover a little bit of our engagement with government. So how have we been working in partnership with government? What have we been asking for? Focusing a little bit more on specifically ACE members, but also now what we're doing more broadly with the Construction Leadership Council to try to support the industry during this sort of short-term phase of sustaining us as businesses, sustaining a certain level of activity, and then moving into making a proper plan for how we recover. So Julian will cover a little bit on that, and then, as I said, it will be myself, Julian and Stuart from Bays who will be available for Q&A. I can't see any questions yet. You're very quiet, so please do start putting your questions through, and we will come back to those at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Hannah, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to hear from all of you today about the stuff that we are doing on engaging with government around the dislocation to the economy that is caused by the COVID-19 outbreak, and particularly how it applies to you as SME businesses. So if we can move on to the first slide there, we can talk you through some of the stuff that we have been doing. There's a huge amount of activity that Hannah has covered off, and that is being done by ACE and others as collectively as possible. So ACE itself, we have been engaging with our members through varying fora, such as webinars, such as virtual conferences, and so on, to find out the issues that are affecting you. We have therefore been feeding that back through three bodies. Hannah has already mentioned the Construction Leadership Council, which she is a member of, and that has been putting that voice directly to senior members of the government, from the Prime Minister to the Chancellor to the Secretary of State at Bays, saying what the industry needs in its roundest terms, exactly what all of our members need to be able to survive. And some of that stuff has come back very, very quickly. So we've had things that we've already mentioned around the coronavirus job retention scheme, the deferring of that, the statutory sick pay. All of that has been because we've been talking to senior members of government right from the get-go to say what the industry will need to do. The second one is the CIC, which we've been sitting on. They had a council meeting yesterday, at which I was present, and we again are feeding those messages into that body to make sure that it is speaking with a single voice. And the third body we are dealing with is, of course, the Infrastructure Alliance, which is ourselves, SECA, and the CPA, to look at all parts of the supply chain to see how this crisis is affecting them, what impact it's having, and how the government can actually bring forward measures to help within that. And so what we can start seeing is some of that popping up in the press feeds if you've been looking around, as you can see on this slide, trying to make sure that we're covering the whole of the UK and getting that message through to what's been happening. And it's not just the large members that we have been looking at. We are very alive to the fact that this will have a huge impact on our SME members as well, hence the webinar today. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what have we been doing engaging on your behalf? Hannah's already gone through some of this. But we did ask for the grant for up to £50,000 for SMEs in our sector to enable them to meet the digital requirement of working from home. Many of you are going to be facing unprecedented costs to you and your staff of essentially running virtual offices now. Everyone's living room, everyone's kitchen, everyone's bedroom may well be becoming a work environment as we all find ourselves shut in for a prolonged period of time. What this has shown a lot of businesses is that many staff don't have the equipment at home to be able to meet those requirements. And so businesses have been stepping forward to provide that equipment, but of course it's a cost for them. And we've been saying to government, really, you need to be aware that that cost is happening on businesses. It's disproportionately affecting SMEs, and that a grant should be able to be created for that. We've also reached out to not just government, but also clients to talk about how we can accelerate the pre-construction phase of government programs from anything from schools, hospitals, roads, and so on. And we are getting a lot of positive feedback from that. I've had just recent meetings with Highways England and DFT around what can be done on our infrastructure networks today. Now they are not being used as much. The road network is seeing a massive reduction in traffic. Not surprisingly, large parts of the country are self-isolating within this, but so has the rail network, which has as well also been brought back essentially into government ownership with the suspension of the franchises and the government becoming responsible for the full costs of that. DFT is saying this provides us with a unique situation to bring forward some of that design work for the future of the networks now. And they are saying, how can we actually engage with our members to make sure that those projects are there? And so I'm in those conversations right now. We're seeing what we can actually do, and we hope that a work program of that caliber will be coming through, which is quite exciting. We are also looking at the fact that the government has committed itself to an infrastructure revolution. We saw in the budgets published only a few weeks ago, I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago now, with the flurry of budget requests we've been getting from the Chancellor, but there was a commitment there for a massive infrastructure revolution covering all sectors of the economy, and you can better believe digital side of that is going to be even higher on the government's agenda, as we are all trying to log into remote access facilities such as this webinar today. It is highlighting how far behind the UK is perhaps in some of its digital technology, but the government's still very much committed to that. It wants to deliver that, and so we are having conversations with them today about how we can invest in the industry. The CLC will in fact be writing to the Prime Minister in the next day or so, outlining what future investment needs to be made in the industry, not for today's, not for the short-term problem that we are facing at the moment, which is severe, but what is focused on building an industry that is capable of delivering that infrastructure revolution. Because when we come out of this crisis, we're going to find ourselves in the midst of a recession. The government's going to want to be able to spearhead regeneration of economic activity, and we know that construction is one of the best ways of being able to do that. So if the government is committed to this infrastructure revolution and wants to put forward those large projects across the country that has been talking about, it needs to have an industry that is capable of delivering them in a new way. And we're saying you can start investing in the businesses to do that. So some of the things that we're already seeing around our requests, we'll be able to do that. That's why we were very keen on ensuring that you're able to keep the quality staff that you have for as long as you can, because those people are going to be so necessary to delivering that program. We're also looking at a series of tax incentives that can be given to the house building sector and further city deals with the mayors. Many of them are very keen to see that actually happen. What they are waiting for merely is approval from the Treasury that they have that money to be able to spend, so that it's filtering it down. And then, of course, the big one that we are also looking at, as many of you may be aware, is AC's Future Consultancy Programme. We are asking for a seed funding of around £1 million to be put into R&D development for the industry, again, looking at that medium long-term programme, ensuring that the industry is capable of delivering it forward. But we've also been focused on some of the other things that Hannah has mentioned. Very much engaged with government. In fact, I was on a call with Downing Street officials on Monday, pushing them to say, look, we need to look at the self-employed. We need to be doing more for SMEs, and we need to be doing more about planning within the country. So as part of that, we got that amendment to the Coronavirus Act that was put through that has now ensured that local authority planning decisions can be made virtually. It seems strange to us today, perhaps, but that was illegal up until yesterday. Councillors had to meet in person to be able to approve those plans. Not anymore. The Secretary of State will be passing orders that enable those authorities to meet virtually, and will be requiring them to do so, alongside a requirement from the government to speed up those planning decisions, so that we can actually get work moving forward, which will help a lot of companies in the rest of the country. We've also mentioned the procurement policy notices that have gone out. That is government-wide advice for everywhere in the UK. However, we do have the issues of devolution. So if you are a business that is operating in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it will be for your local executives to implement that notice in a way they see fit. So we are working through our groups in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland with the executives there to say, you need to make this process as streamlined and as efficient as possible to make sure that work continues to flow forward, so that our members are able to provide that value and keep their employees on a basis of work. We have also been liaising with the BEIS to see how much we can engage with them and deliver some of those problems. There's a few things that we are looking to say could be reshaped. So for instance, around the coronavirus job retention scheme, we're seeing that there's a lot of confusion there. The guidance could become a little more flexible with the scheme. It could be delivered in a little better way. So we're talking to officials about how that can happen. We're also asking for the government to issue an automatic VAT, PAYE and CIS holiday. It's partly in recognition that the time to pay offer is placing considerable pressure on HMRC resources, which is delaying the industry's ability to access that relief, which is sort of counterbalancing the government's desire to get that money to companies as fast as possible. So we're saying that the government should consider a PAYE and CIS holiday for all companies for 3 months with no financial penalty, as a way of speeding up that process. We're also looking at creating a better grant system. We have seen that there's been a £25,000 grant given to retail, hospitality and leisure businesses with a property value rateable between roughly £15,000 and £51,000. We're saying that a similar scheme should be offered to those in the construction sector, who are severely impacted by work stoppages, around 75 to 100% of their work. And that this would be a way to ensure that SMEs who work in smaller projects would be able to access that money right away. We're also looking at the apprenticeship levy, which of course many of you may know you're still paying. We think that should be put on hold for the moment, and that unspent contributions should be used to support your employment and training of your existing apprentices, building up the caliber of the staff that you have within your firms, ensuring that you're able to jump forward when we start seeing increased activity around that infrastructure evolution that we've discussed coming much more to the fore. So if we can move to the next slide. So what are we looking on at that longer term engagement? Because it's very much a three-stage process from the way we are looking at things. It's saying, right, we're in an immediate crisis now. What do we need to do to ensure that the loss is stemmed and that businesses can remain as viable entities employing their people today? We then need to look at that medium-term view, which is really the next 3 to 6 months. Saying that how do we manage in this state of lockdown and then perhaps coming out of it and we get people back to work. And then of course there's much more that longer term, which is really the next year to 18 months of how we deal with the economic fallout that has been caused by this contraction within Q2. It's no mystery to everyone that we will be entering a period of recession. Everyone is predicting that. In fact, some people were saying we were entering that period of recession in Q1, but we are definitely going to be through recession in Q2 and Q3. How quickly we come out of that really depends on the government's actions today, the investment that they do. And we're saying we as an industry are able to do that. So we're saying that infrastructure investment and construction will be the catalyst to that long-term economic growth. So please stay committed to that infrastructure revolution. Stay committed to the pipelines that we have seen in the past. We're hoping for a strong national infrastructure strategy to be published this year, along with a spending plan for over the 3-year period, a comprehensive spending review that is announced. Hopefully that will give us a large amount of spending headroom going forward over that period of time. We're asking that money that is already earmarked in the budget continue to be committed to the systems that it's going to be doing. And we also are asking for those additional measures that we've just been discussing to be added on. We want some clarity of action as well around some of the major projects. For those of you who joined one of our webinars just recently, we were looking at the impact of the High Court decision on Heathrow that essentially stopped the development of the third runway due to the impact of climate change requirements from the government, that net zero target that we saw pass last year. This has had a detrimental effect on a number of projects across the country as more and more people are challenging those in the courts, and this is causing delay. We want the government to be very clear on what it's doing. If it needs to change the plan consent orders that is given for those, do so quickly and rapidly so that those projects can go forward, because they are vital and they do have an impact across the whole of the country. We've already mentioned some of the new opportunities that we are seeing, and we are trying to engage with clients to say, look, you're in an unprecedented period of time. This is an opportunity, not just a risk to your business. You can do a lot of your design work now. You can do a lot more of your forward planning, your master planning of projects now. Get involved with your consulting engineering partners and say, what can we actually do? How can you help us make these projects better? How can we improve productivity? How can we deliver these projects in a faster, more efficient way? Now, don't focus on the building, focus on the design, and you'll reap huge rewards going forward. And that's the conversations that we're absolutely having now. And then, of course, the importance of the research and development. We can't just cut off our development of our industry. We know the technological revolution that we are undertaking is in fact allowing most of the country to continue operating just as we are today, virtually, in a way that we would not have been able to think about really 5 years ago. So that technology is a massive, massive boon to the UK economy. We need to find a way to harness it for the infrastructure sector and to embed it into the projects that we are doing and the very business structures that we are looking at. Hence our commitment to continuing to push forward with the future of consultancy requests so that member firms can continue to benefit from that investment to the best way possible and become global leaders, enabling them to not only compete in the UK market, but compete globally as world beaters. So if we move to the next slide. So there's what we are doing. It's a huge amount of work. We are engaged on a daily activity. To give you an idea of what is happening now, you are often having, or certainly I and my team are having, conversations with government officials or clients really early in the morning. We're bringing issues to them. We're having live conversations through varying digital media to talk about some of these issues. We then see a bit of a hiatus around lunchtime and the early afternoon when those things are digested, and we're then seeing announcements coming forward from the government at those 5, 6 o'clock meetings that you're seeing with the Prime Minister. So those are some of the things that have been involved in. I myself am involved in 2 weekly calls with the Downing Street team on how this is engaging. The CLC is meeting on a regular basis to deal with that. There are working groups within the CIC that are meeting on almost a daily basis to push forward with this. And then there are the day-to-day conversations that are happening. So it's a very, very fast-moving situation. But the more we can hear back from members such as yourself about the things that matter to you, about the issues that are concerns to you, the more I can feed that back in. So we really want to keep that 2-stage conversation with your members, and that's why webinars such as this are very helpful to us. So over to you, Hannah.
Brilliant, thank you, Julian. I know that was quite a lot of information from both of us to get out, but I'm conscious we do have quite a number of questions, so I think we'll go straight to the questions now. And if we can try and be succinct in our responses, because I want to get through all of these. So Julian, the first one is a question to yourself around the Coronavirus Act and the implications on planning. Does that now immediately apply in the devolved nations, or does it require them to pass further legislation themselves?
That is a very good question. It actually is a UK wide act. Looking at it, it does require those devolved governments to actually implement their sides of it. But where it is necessary, the UK government has actually taken over quite a large stretch of powers. So it is bypassing devolution where it needs to on a huge number of issues. But it does still require the Secretary of State to create supporting regulations to implement it. We haven't really seen anything like this since the Second World War in its implications. So yes, it is in short a UK-wide body. The UK government will hope to work with devolved bodies, but it can overrule them if it needs to.
Okay, fine. Stuart, from Bose, a question for you in relation to the coronavirus job retention scheme. Where do companies register to put the staff on the furlough?
So that question has been led by HMRC, and the details that are currently being worked at the moment, and guidance as well.
You're a little bit.
We don't have that. I don't have the kind of the definitive contact details at the moment.
Okay, but it's being done through HMRC, isn't it? And they're expecting to have the system up by the end of April, as we understand it. So you haven't missed anything, but it will come from HMRC, and you will be able to do it by the end of April, as I understand it. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, Hannah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay. The next question we have is in the sort of the SME-backed loans. So again, some feedback here, Stuart, around the banks perhaps being more inclined to push their own products. Now, this is feedback that we're hearing, and we know that there's this challenge around personal guarantees. Obviously, we've had quite a number of conversations over the last few days around this, Stuart. I know that you're feeding this back in, but is this something that Bose is hearing across the board, not just from our sector? And what's the sort of the conversation happening within the department to address some of this?
So it's certainly true that we're hearing it across the construction sector. That very point was fed back to me yesterday by a different trade association. As to whether it is being heard more broadly across different sectors, I couldn't comment on that, because at the moment there's not that kind of, we're not kind of seeing that being cited in that kind of information. So there's a kind of, it's fair to say that the structures in the department are kind of being established at present in terms of sharing that intel. So it's not, we've not currently kind of got access to that information or been cited on it. But it's certainly an issue for construction you flagged.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, because you have channels, don't you? I know directly into central government, into HMRC, so you're able to feed things like that back for us, aren't you? So as more and more companies come forward, as we get more evidence, I think that's the sorts of things we can escalate to yourself, isn't it, to pick up on our behalf?
Yeah, just to kind of give some quick context. Yes, I've got access to HMRC. I've been speaking to them recently about this scheme, and more generally, we are reaching out to TAs. Any feedback that comes back to us from yourself, Hannah, and other TAs is kind of fed into the regular reporting mechanisms that are looked at by ministers and are going straight to the top of the department, i.e. the Secretary of State, which is then fed into regular ministerial committees. So the intelligence we're getting is impacting on decisions and policies being developed and made.
Mm-hmm. No, that's brilliant to know that we've got that that mechanism, because I think, you know, I for one appreciate all the government's doing, and the rate at which this, you know, this has been mobilised. You can understand that there will be things that need to be ironed out. So it's good that we're able to provide that feedback. So that's helpful. Okay, right. I've got quite a few questions on the job retention scheme. So that's fine. So we don't have all the answers. I think we are expecting some further guidance on this next week with some of the detail around exactly how to implement it. So I think there will be probably a lot more answers in that. So with the questions that we've got on these, we will tell you what we know, and I can certainly feedback what we've perhaps fed into Stuart for him to sort of escalate up and speak to his colleagues about requesting clarifications on when that guidance comes out. So we've had a question about the flexibility of the scheme. So this is around looking at whether or not government, the furlough scheme would be possible if we go to a 3-day working week rather than a 5-day working week. Now, I will, ahead of the guidance next week, which will confirm this for certain, the approach that I'm hearing from other members, and I'll say this is a member interpretation of it, is that at present, we believe, following the guidance that's already out there to the letter, you cannot do it to pay someone part of the week. You either have to be 100% furloughed or you have to be not furloughed. So the exercise that firms are going through at the moment is saying, for example, if you employ 100 engineers, you would need to furlough 20 of them rather than have some of them working, you know, having everybody working 4 days a week. Now, we have fed back that there are a number of challenges with that around how you work out who those 20 are. And actually, whether there could be some accommodation and some flexibility. So this is something that is very live because Stuart and I have been talking about it. But actually, is there a possibility to have some flexibility whereby people could volunteer to be furloughed, because we would appreciate over the next 3 months, some people might have children at home, or they might have caring responsibilities. They might have a number of reasons why they might actually want to be furloughed. Equally, another way of introducing flexibility might be to be able to furlough people rather than do it in a big 3-month block, be able to do it flexibly and furlough, you know, 1 week on, 1 week off. Now, I will say at the moment, those are suggestions that we are sort of actively discussing with Stuart and his team. We don't know if that's flexibility is allowed yet. So for now, it is you are either 100% furloughed or you are not furloughed. Have you got anything further to add?
Not really, and I think you've probably made quite a fair, accurate interpretation. The other thing I'll just add is that there's going to be guidance published for both employers and employees very shortly, and it will be developed over the coming weeks. But HMRC are prioritising it being made as accessible as possible because they're conscious that it needs to be kind of quite simple and easy for people to do this. And it's also going to be, they're also looking at how the scheme will interact with existing employment rights. Hello?
Yes, sorry. So just moving on to the to the next question. So we've got a question here around the length of time that people are furloughed. So can the 3-month furlough period be taken up at any time over the next few months? Now, I think as it stands, that is quite strict. So we're saying that it would need to be from March for a 3-month period. You can do less than 3 months. So you could do, for example, from the 1st of April until the end of May. But the current guidance is just that the scheme is open for the next 3 months. Is that right, Stuart?
That's correct, exactly. Open for 3 months, no limit to the amount of funding available, and the Chancellor has said that he's open to continuing it if needed, but at the moment it's only open for 3 months.
Okay. Right. So then we have again another question on the same scheme around evidencing that someone is unable to work. So this again I think sort of touches a little bit on our question around flexibility of the scheme and utilisation of staff perhaps, but again we don't, as I understand it at the moment, Stuart, they were still awaiting the guidance around what an employer would have to produce to prove that someone's unable to work. Because obviously if you're a shop and you've shut your shop because the Prime Minister's asked you to, then that's quite black and white. In our industry it may be a little bit more of a grey area. Yes. Is that's something that we perhaps would expect in the guidance next week?
I would expect so, yes.
Okay, brilliant.
The guidance this week I think will be quite clear in kind of, because we've received quite a lot of questions on the scheme, so they are conscious that this needs to be very clear given the amount of nuances in the scheme. And so yes, I would expect that next week to be very clear. I would say that they're saying HMRC are saying it's going to be issued very shortly. Very shortly, that means next week. You would kind of hope so, but they've not said next week. They just said very shortly. But I know they're working at pace to deliver this.
Okay. No, that's great. Right, thank you. So yes, we'll be on tenterhooks waiting for that one next week. And we should say that you've got a little bit of time, appreciating you might need to be building your workforce plans at the moment. You can't actually process this until the end of April anyway. So we have got a bit of time to just bottom out exactly before we put our applications in to make sure that we aren't on the wrong side of that. Okay, so yeah. I have a procurement question. I knew we couldn't get through a webinar without a procurement question. There's always one. So this one is around, I mentioned the public procurement exercises, and this question is somebody saying that they've struggled in the past to get onto public procurement. They find the process quite large and cumbersome, perhaps very detailed. Is this going to simplify it? So I think in the short term, it might well do. So where, but this will be quite specific in terms of where public sector bodies are procuring under, an emergency. So if they need an emergency repair, if they need some sort of emergency design work, there is under this policy procurement notice the guidance that you can, simplify the process. You can make it shorter. You can make it less onerous, just to make sure that that happens. So there is that, but I think that in terms of sort of, long-term pipeline or any volume of work is probably very, very small. I would suggest that is something as we move into the recovery phase that the government is going to need to think about, and it was certainly something that I'll be talking to them about in my role as ACE, because if we are going to have an effective recovery for the sector and for the wider economy, we need to be getting the pipeline out at pace. And making sure that we are supporting the whole spectrum of the industry so that SMEs aren't excluded. So again, I think this is an opportunity perhaps for us to influence that, but obviously no guarantees until we're into that phase. There's certainly no commitment at the moment, but then you wouldn't expect that to be, because what we're focusing on is the sort of short-term emergency response.
I think what I would say to that, Hannah, is completely appreciate the point. We have got colleagues in the kind of team working on procurement. So if we can log that question and you can your colleagues can feed that over to me after this session, I can kind of connect you up with the procurement kind of expert who's not myself, and I can have a conversation with you colleagues about that.
Okay. No, that's great. Right, so we have a question in relation to a client here who wants to support SMEs with application forms and things, and help with the loans, with accessing the loans. I think that's brilliant. So thank you very much for wanting to do that for your supply chain. They're asking a bit of detail about what would need to be provided. Now, on the face of it, and there is more guidance you can access online, but you do need to be able to prove that you are a viable concern coming out of this. So there would be a need for, and I think it is at quite a basic level, but there would be a need for things like a business plan, being able to demonstrate a pipeline of work. So again, if you're a client who's in this, certainly think about how you might be able to assist your SMEs in your supply chain by providing that evidence to the banks. And full application details are available on the links on the website. Okay, so we've got a question on forward pipeline of work and focusing and accelerating design. Now, I will say this is probably an area where we haven't quite got to yet in terms of, you know, making sure that we can just survive the next few weeks from a cash flow perspective, but it will be something we turn to. Now, Julian, what do we know from the commitments made in the budget around some of, particularly the public sector? You know, there were some quite big transport announcements. Are those likely to hold up, and do we think that, you know, that funding for the design and development work there is going to be forthcoming still?
So talking to Treasury officials, there's definitely a commitment from HM Treasury to see that through. However, we must be a little careful with the announcements that were made in the budget, because they were dependent on a comprehensive spending review and a national infrastructure strategy being developed really now, Q2 and Q3. So therefore, we were really paying attention to the main budget, which will obviously happen in November, as has happened in previous years, to see how that will go forward. However, the individual departments and the clients' organizations themselves are very committed to seeing that go through. We have had spending commitments already around some of the large projects around rail and road. Those will continue to hold up. And the existing pipeline should continue as has outlined by the government. But we are wanting to see where that money will come from, where it will actually be committed. And the headroom the government was hoping to use to borrow to meet some of those requirements is being eaten away very quickly by our responses to coronavirus. So that is something that I am looking at. We are seeing that as the midterm priorities for the industry that I discussed in my presentation to everyone on that. But it all depends if a comprehensive spending review is conducted in Q2. There is some question around that. HM Treasury is keen to do that, but a lot of the other departments are hitting back saying they simply do not have the bandwidth to be able to meet the requirements of Treasury. So we're keeping that alive at the moment and keeping our eye on it.
Okay, I'm just very conscious of time. I think we'll do one more question, and anybody's question that we haven't answered, we will look at and look at it, feeding that back to you directly. So one very quick question to finish, Stuart. Can we confirm the definition of an SME in relation to the grants and the funding? Do you have what's your determination of who is an SME and who is not?
So I think the definition would be the number of staff, sorry, the number of employees, and potentially the kind of their kind of, I'm trying to find the word here, the finances, their revenue generation. But I would suspect that once the guidance comes out, that'll be a lot clearer on that.
Okay, and I think
if you want me to,
go on.
If you want me to, Hannah, if you want me to, we've obviously got a central briefing hub here, and I can kind of check that, because these definitions I need to be very clear, and I wouldn't really want to speculate and provide wrong information here.
No, that's fine, and I think there is some slight difference. Certainly with the loan scheme, they're using a different threshold than we would, you know, they're doing it on revenue rather than, like I say, number of employees. So that might be something that we could clarify for each of the schemes and maybe get the information up on our website. I think that would be okay. Right, so just conscious of time, and everybody probably wants to go and have their lunch. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. please do sign up to future webinars on specific topics that we have. And we're going to record, this one has been recorded, so it will be up online if you want to watch it back, if you want to refer to it again in future. So thank you very much to my panelists, and thank you all very much for joining us and your very, very good questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you all.